There's a version of success most people spend their entire lives chasing. It looks responsible. It looks stable. It looks like progress. You earn more, you buy more, you slowly build a life that, on the surface, makes sense. And for a while, everything feels aligned. Until something uncomfortable begins to show up. Not all at once, just in small moments you can't quite explain. Because despite doing what you were told was right, the result starts to feel off. And here's the part most people never question. What if the problem isn't how you're playing the game, but the fact that the game was never designed for you to win?
There's a reason that feeling is so difficult to explain. Because nothing is obviously wrong. From the outside, everything still makes sense. You're doing what responsible people do. You earn. You save. You try to make careful decisions with what you have. And over time, those decisions begin to take shape. Not as a single moment, but as a collection of things that start to define your life. A payment here, an upgrade there. A long-term commitment that feels justified. Each one, on its own, seems reasonable. Each one, on its own, feels like progress. And that's exactly why it works. Because the system doesn't rely on one big mistake. It relies on many small, logical decisions that quietly move in the same direction. Not forward, but deeper. Deeper into a structure where your time, your energy, and your future income are already accounted for, long before you realize it. Most people were never taught to question this. They were taught to participate in it, to recognize the signals of stability, to associate ownership with progress, to believe that if something has value, then owning it must mean you're building something. But ownership is not the same as growth. And that distinction changes everything. Because something can feel like it belongs to you, while still demanding more from you over time. Not once, not all at once, but continuously, quietly, predictably. And here's where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Because what most people measure is not how something behaves. It's how it looks. Does it make life easier? Does it feel secure? Does it signal that you're doing better than before? If the answer is yes, then it must be working. But that assumption skips a much more important question. Not what it gives you today, but what it continues to take from you tomorrow. And once you start looking at things that way, a pattern begins to emerge. One that isn't obvious at first, but becomes impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. Because the same structure repeats itself again and again across different areas of life. Different decisions, different stages, different people, but the outcome is almost always the same. It doesn't happen suddenly. There's no single moment where everything collapses. Instead, it accumulates. Small costs, extended over time, compounded through habit, reinforced by what everyone else is doing, until one day, the numbers don't match the feeling anymore, and that quiet sense you couldn't explain earlier finally starts to make sense. Because the issue was never effort, and it was never intention. It was direction. And to see that clearly, you have to look at what most people never stop to examine. Not what they own, but what those things actually do after they own them. Most people don't misunderstand effort. They misunderstand direction. Because effort on its own feels productive. If you're working, earning, paying for things that seem necessary, it's easy to assume you're moving forward. But movement and progress are not the same thing. And that distinction is where everything starts to shift. There's a different way to look at this, not based on what something is called, but based on what it actually does. Because every financial decision, every purchase, every commitment, moves in one of two directions over time. It either gives something back to you, or it continues to take from you. That's it. Not complicated, not theoretical, just directional. But here's where it becomes difficult to see. Because the things that take from you don't feel like losses. They feel like progress. They come with structure, with justification, with a sense of responsibility attached to them. And because of that, they're rarely questioned. You don't question the payment, because it makes sense. You don't question the cost, because everyone else accepts it. You don't question the long-term impact, because it doesn't show up immediately. Instead, it spreads out across months, across years, across decisions that seem unrelated, but are quietly connected. And over time, something subtle begins to happen. Your income doesn't disappear, but it becomes allocated pre-assigned, committed in advance. A portion goes here, another portion goes there. Some of it is flexible, but most of it isn't. And once that structure is in place, your ability to move freely starts to shrink. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the system you're operating inside has already made most of the decisions for. This is where the real difference shows up. Because an actual asset doesn't just sit there. It doesn't just exist. It changes your position over time. It creates space. It gives you options. It returns something to you without requiring constant input. But most of the things people focus on do the opposite. They require attention. They require maintenance. They require continued payment just to remain where they are. And when you step back and look at it clearly, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Because what looks like accumulation often behaves like obligation. Not visible at first, not obvious in the moment, but consistent over time. And once you start seeing that pattern, you begin to understand something most people miss. It's not about how much you have. It's about what those things do after they become part of your life. And that's where the difference is made. Not in what you own, but in what owns your future. Let's start with something almost no one questions. Not because it's efficient, but because it feels necessary. The car. For most people, it's one of the first major things they commit to. Not as a luxury, but as a step forward, a sign that life is becoming more stable, more independent, more established. And on the surface, that makes sense. It gives you mobility, it saves time, it connects you to work, to opportunity, to everything around you. So the decision feels logical, even responsible. But that's only one side of the equation, because the moment that decision is made, something else begins. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that is completely predictable. The value starts to fall, not years later, immediately. In many cases, a new vehicle can lose close to 10% of its value within the first few weeks. And within a few years, a large portion of what was paid simply disappears. But the cost doesn't disappear with it. It expands. Insurance, fuel, maintenance, repairs, registration, unexpected breakdowns. Individually, none of these feel extreme. But together, they form a continuous outflow. Over time, that outflow adds up. Year after year, quietly, consistently. And if you actually step back and calculate it, not just the purchase price, but the total cost of keeping it, it becomes something very different from what it first appeared to be. Because what you have is not something that grows, it's something that requires. And here's where the pattern becomes clear. Because the car doesn't produce anything. It doesn't return value. It enables activity, but it doesn't generate it, which means the entire system around it is designed to extract. Manufacturers, financing, insurance, fuel, service. Each part takes a small piece. And together, they create a structure that feels like ownership, but behaves like obligation. And that's the difference most people never stop to examine. Because when something is useful, it's easy to assume it's valuable in the same way. But usefulness and financial growth are not the same thing. One supports your life, the other changes your position. And if something only does the first, while continuously taking from the second, then over time, it moves you in a direction you didn't intend. Not forward, just further committed. There's one belief that almost no one questions. Not because it's proven, but because it's repeated so often, it starts to feel like truth. That owning a home is always a step forward. It's seen as stability, security, a foundation for everything else. And in many ways it is. It gives you control over your space. It removes uncertainty. It feels permanent. Which is exactly why it's so rarely examined. Because the conversation usually stops at ownership, not at what ownership actually requires over time. Let's slow it down. A typical home purchase isn't just a price. It's a structure. There's the mortgage, which over decades can cost far more than the original value of the home itself. There are property taxes, which don't disappear once the house is paid off. There's insurance, maintenance, repairs that don't arrive gradually, but all at once. A roof, a system failure, something unexpected that instantly turns into a major expense. Individually, each of these makes sense, but together, they form a long-term commitment that extends far beyond the initial decision. And here's where the pattern begins to shift. Because for something to truly move you forward financially, it has to do more than just hold value. It has to outperform what it costs to keep, and that's not guaranteed. In some markets, over long periods of time, housing prices rise, but not evenly, not consistently, and not always in a way that offsets the full cost of ownership, which means the outcome isn't as simple as buy, hold, profit. It's buy, maintain finance, wait, and hope the numbers work. And sometimes they don't. There have been entire periods where people followed every correct step, bought responsibly, paid consistently, and still found themselves in a position where what they owned was worth less than what they owed. Not because they failed, but because the system moved differently than they expected. And this is the part most people don't calculate, because the value of a home is visible. You can see it, track it, compare it. But the total cost of owning it is spread across time. And when something is spread out like that, it becomes harder to feel, harder to question. So the assumption remains, if I own this, I'm building something. But ownership alone doesn't determine direction, because something can feel stable while quietly absorbing decades of income. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly enough that it still feels like progress. And that's what makes it powerful, because it doesn't break the system. It reinforces it. There's another belief that feels almost impossible to question, because it starts early, and it's reinforced by everyone. That education is the safest investment you can make. From a young age, the message is simple. Study hard. Get into a good school. Build a future. And for many people, that path does lead somewhere. Better opportunities. Higher income. More options. But that's only part of the picture. Because what's often presented as a guaranteed return is actually a distribution. Some outcomes are strong, but many are not. And the difference between them is rarely explained in advance. Over time, the cost of education has increased dramatically. Not just tuition, but everything around it. Housing, fees, living expenses. For many students, that means starting adult life with a significant financial obligation. Not as a mistake, but as a requirement. And here's where the structure becomes difficult. Because that obligation doesn't adjust to your outcome. The cost is fixed, but the return is not. Someone entering a high-demand field may recover that cost quickly. But for others, the numbers don't align as easily. Income grows slowly. Expenses remain constant. And the gap between them becomes something that has to be managed over time, not resolved. Managed. In some cases, payments don't even reduce the balance meaningfully. They maintain it, which turns what was expected to be an investment into something that behaves very differently. Because instead of creating momentum, it creates pressure. Pressure to choose stability over risk. Pressure to accept certain paths over others. Pressure to prioritize income over direction. And over time, that pressure compounds. Not just financially, but in the decisions it influences. What job you take, what you delay, what you give up before you even try. And this is the part that's rarely discussed. Because education does create value, but not always in the way it's marketed. A degree is not a return. It's access. What happens after that depends on variables that aren't guaranteed, which means the outcome is not built into the system. It has to be created within it. And if the cost is fixed, but the return is uncertain, then what you have is not a guaranteed investment. It's a position, one that can move you forward or hold you in place, depending on how the rest of the system responds. And that's where the pattern begins to repeat. Because once again, something that feels like progress doesn't always behave that way over time.
Some of the most expensive decisions don't feel expensive at all, because they're not presented as costs. They're presented as protection, as responsibility, as something you're supposed to have. And once something is framed that way, it stops being questioned. Take a closer look at how many financial products are actually positioned. They're rarely sold as transactions. They're sold as solutions, a way to secure your future, a way to protect your family, a way to be prepared for uncertainty. And on the surface, that makes sense, because risk is real, uncertainty exists, things do go wrong. But the structure behind these products is not designed around your outcome. It's designed around probability. And probability has a very specific feature. It can be priced, which means every product built on it is structured to collect more than it pays out. Not sometimes, consistently. That's how the system works. For every dollar that flows into it, only a portion ever comes back out. The rest is absorbed through fees, through commissions, through layers of cost that are built into the structure itself. And because those costs are distributed over time, they rarely feel significant in the moment. A small payment here, a manageable premium there, nothing that feels like a loss. But over years, over decades, those small outflows accumulate into something much larger. And here's where it becomes difficult to see clearly, because the benefit is conditional. It may happen, but it also may not, while the cost is guaranteed, which creates an imbalance most people never calculate. They evaluate the possibility of protection, but not the certainty of payment. And over time, that difference matters. Because money that is continuously redirected is money that no longer has the chance to grow elsewhere. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly enough that it doesn't trigger concern. And that's what makes the structure effective. It doesn't take large amounts. It takes consistent ones. And consistency, over time, is more powerful than magnitude. So what feels like safety can quietly become limitation. Not because protection is unnecessary, but because the way it's structured prioritizes the system providing it, not the person inside it. And once you begin to see that pattern, not just in one product, but across many, you start to recognize something deeper. Because this isn't about one decision, it's about a design, one that repeats itself in different forms, different industries, different choices, but always with the same direction. Small, continuous outflows that feel justified in the moment, but compound into something much larger over time. And once again, what appears to be stability doesn't always move you forward.
There's a different kind of decision that feels almost impossible to question. Because it's not driven by necessity, it's driven by potential. The idea of who you could become, so you buy the tools, the equipment, the setup that matches the version of yourself you're trying to build. A home gym, a camera, a workspace, something that signals intention. And in that moment, it feels like progress. Not because anything has changed yet, but because it feels like you're moving in the right direction. And that feeling is powerful. Because it replaces action with preparation. It makes it feel like something has already begun. But over time, something subtle starts to happen. The equipment stays. But the behavior doesn't. The routine fades. The schedule breaks. The intention gets replaced by something else. And what was supposed to be used becomes something that just exists. Not broken. Not useless. Just inactive. And here's where the pattern becomes clear. Because the value of that purchase was never in the object itself. It was in the behavior it was supposed to support. And when that behavior doesn't materialize, the entire equation changes. What looked like an investment in growth becomes a cost of intention, not because the idea was wrong, but because it assumed a future version of you that didn't fully arrive. And the system doesn't adjust for that. The money has already been spent. The cost has already been committed. But the return never shows up. This happens more often than most people realize. Not just with large purchases, but with small ones repeated over time. Things bought for who you might become. Books never finished. Tools rarely used. Equipment that sits untouched, long after the motivation that justified it has faded. And none of these decisions feel wrong on their own. Each one makes sense in isolation. Each one feels aligned with improvement, but together, they form a pattern. One where money is spent on potential instead of outcome. And over time, that difference matters. Because potential doesn't generate anything on its own. It has to be realized, maintained, repeated. And without that, what you're left with is not growth. Just a collection of things that once represented it. And once again, what felt like progress doesn't move you forward. It simply stays where it is. There's a certain kind of story that spreads faster than most. Not because it's common, but because it's memorable. Someone buys something small, holds it long enough, And one day, it becomes worth far more than they expected. A rare card, a limited item, something that wasn't meant to be valuable, until it suddenly was. And those stories travel. They get repeated, shared, pointed to as proof that value can appear where no one was looking. But what rarely travels with those stories is everything that didn't work, all the items that never increased in value, all the collections that sat untouched, all the things that were bought with the same belief and quietly lost it. Because the truth is, value like that doesn't come from ownership. It comes from conditions, scarcity, demand, timing, and, most importantly, a future that unfolds in a very specific way. And none of those are controlled by the person holding the item, which means what looks like an investment is often something else entirely, a position based on uncertainty. Because unlike something that generates value over time, this type of purchase depends on something external happening, someone else deciding it's worth more, a market forming around it, a trend continuing longer than expected. And if those things don't happen, nothing changes. The item remains exactly what it was. But the expectation attached to it doesn't. And that's where the gap begins. Because the mind holds on to the possibility, the idea that it could become something more, even when there's no consistent mechanism behind it. And over time, that belief becomes its own kind of cost. Not just financially, but in attention, in patience, in the decisions delayed because something else might work out. And this is where the pattern connects back. Because once again, what feels like potential doesn't necessarily move you forward. It waits. And waiting, without a system that produces anything, is not neutral. It's passive, which means time passes. Value shifts. And what you're holding remains dependent on something outside your control. And when you look at it that way, the difference becomes clear. Because real movement doesn't rely on being discovered. It creates something, returns something, builds something over time. But this relies on being right. And being right once is not the same as having a system that works consistently. And that's why so many of these stories feel powerful, but don't repeat. Because you're not seeing the system, you're seeing the exception. Not every decision feels important. In fact, most of them don't. They're small, routine, easy to justify. Something you buy because you need it, or because it feels reasonable, or because it improves your day, just a little. Clothing, upgrades, things that seem minor in the moment. And individually, they are. A purchase here, another one there, nothing that feels significant on its own, which is exactly why they're rarely examined. Because attention tends to go toward the big decisions. The obvious ones, the ones that feel heavy, but it's often the smaller ones, repeated over time, that create the largest impact. Not through magnitude, but through consistency, a small amount, multiplied across months, across years, across habits that feel normal. And over time, something subtle begins to form. A pattern of spending that doesn't stand out, but never really stops. And because it's tied to daily life, to identity, to routine, to comfort, it becomes part of the background. Invisible, not questioned, not tracked, just accepted. But here's where the shift happens. Because when something is repeated often enough, it stops being small. It becomes structural, not a one-time decision, but a continuous one. And continuous decisions have direction, even when they don't feel like they do. Because money that leaves consistently behaves differently than money that leaves once. It doesn't just reduce what you have. It reduces what could have been built. Not dramatically, not in a way that's easy to notice, but steadily enough that over time, the gap begins to grow between what you expected and what actually accumulates. And that gap is rarely traced back to these decisions because they never felt like the problem. They felt normal, necessary, even deserved. And maybe they are. But that's not the question. The question is not whether something is justified. It's whether it moves you forward or keeps you in place. And when something repeats often enough, without creating anything in return, it doesn't need to be large to have a lasting effect. Because direction, over time, is more powerful than intention. And once again, What feels insignificant in the moment doesn't always stay that way. There's one belief that feels more certain than all the others, because it doesn't require explanation. It feels obvious that holding cash is the safest position you can take. No risk, no volatility, no uncertainty, just stability. And for a moment, that's true. The number doesn't change. It stays exactly where you left it, untouched, predictable. And that predictability feels like control, especially in a world where everything else seems to move. So the decision feels responsible, even cautious. But here's the part that isn't immediately visible, because while the number stays the same, what it represents does not. Slowly, quietly, continuously, the value begins to shift, not in a way you can see on a screen, not in a way that triggers concern, but in a way that compounds over time. Prices adjust. Costs rise. What something used to cover, it no longer does. And this doesn't happen suddenly. There's no single moment where the change is obvious. It happens gradually enough that it feels normal, expected, and that's what makes it difficult to recognize, because nothing appears to be lost. But something is. And over longer periods of time, that difference becomes significant. Money that once had a certain reach now stretches less, not because it disappeared, but because its ability to do what it once could has been reduced. And this is where the contradiction becomes clear, because what feels like safety is not neutral. It has direction, and that direction is slow erosion. Not dramatic, not alarming, but consistent. And consistency over time is what determines outcome, which means holding still is not the same as preserving value. It's allowing it to change without noticing. And here's what makes this even more difficult. Because the people who rely on this the most, those trying to be careful, those trying to avoid risk, are often the ones most affected by it. Not because they made a mistake, but because they chose what felt safest in a system that quietly rewards movement. And once you see that, the pattern becomes complete. Because across everything we've looked at, different decisions, different forms, different reasons, the outcome follows the same direction. Not all at once, but over time.
By now, the pattern should feel familiar, not because it's complicated, but because it repeats. Different forms, different decisions, different reasons, but the same direction. Things that look like progress, but behave like obligation. Not all at once, not obviously, but slowly enough that they become part of life before they're ever questioned. And that's what makes it difficult to see, because nothing feels like a mistake. Each decision makes sense on its own. Each step feels justified, and yet over time, the outcome begins to separate from the expectation. Not because of effort, not because of discipline, but because of direction. Because if most of what you accumulate continues to take from you, then no matter how much you add, the result doesn't change in the way you expected. And this is where the shift happens. Because once you stop looking at what things are called and start looking at what they do, the system becomes easier to see. Not as something hidden, but as something consistent. A structure that rewards what returns value and slowly absorbs what doesn't. And the difference between those two is not always obvious at first, because one looks like growth, and the other often looks exactly the same, until enough time has passed, until enough decisions have stacked, until that quiet feeling from the beginning finally has a clear explanation. And when that happens, the question changes. It's no longer, what should I own? It becomes, what actually moves me forward? Because the goal was never to accumulate more. It was to change your position, to create space, options, freedom over time. And those things don't come from what looks valuable. They come from what behaves that way, consistently, even when no one is watching, even when it's not obvious. And once you start seeing that difference, you don't just think differently about money, you think differently about decisions, about time, about what you agree to carry and what you choose to let go. Because in the end, it was never about what you owned. It was about what was quietly shaping your future while you thought you were building it.